Hey everybody, welcome back to part 4 of how to make a non-stretch cloth cover for your dress form. You can see my ditto form is now nude again, sporting her gray knit cover. All right, you can see in front of me, I've taken apart all the pieces, and I also marked the seams where I had to make fine-tune adjustments in green for the most part. So if we take a closer look here, you can see that, like for example here, I had taken the princess seam in a little bit right here, okay, and then over here as well. That's it for the lower pieces. Let me just put those aside. Let's take a closer look at the upper pieces. Okay, so this is what happened on the upper pieces. And my biggest adjustment, or the biggest change I had to make on the top, is my center front piece needed to be adjusted here. So the princess seam along the center front was too long. So I actually took it up almost 3/8 of an inch. And then I retrimmed the seam allowance. So that was a big change. Let's take a look at the upper front pieces, because that's where the side front and center front piece need a little special attention. If you're familiar with princess seam patterns, you have to ease in the extra on the side front piece around the bust apex to the center front piece. You'll remember when we were draping these pieces, I marked 2 inches above and below the apex. And then the extra fabric that was sort of trapped there, we eased in. And you can see the way I do my gathering stitches to ease that in is I put 1 row of stitching on the seam allowance side and another row of gathering stitches inside in the garment. And what that does is it allows me to pull up those gathering stitches so they're held on either side. So when I go to sew, it creates a smooth finish. So that's how I gathered this section in. And depending on the shape of your bust, you're going to have more or less here to gather. So when you're draping your side front piece, don't smush all of the extra fabric down on the bottom because it won't fit right. Make sure you keep that up here as you're draping and then gather it in. So that's how my pattern pieces look. And what we're going to do now is, and I know this might seem a little like an extra unneeded step, but just to be really accurate, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut off all of my seam allowances on these pieces, and where I made changes I'll follow the green line. Okay, so I can just get a very accurate fabric piece for what the shape was. Then we're going to trace that onto paper and add the seam allowances back in, and that'll give us a more accurate final pattern. So I'm going to go through and just cut off all of these seam allowances really carefully using my rotary cutter. And I'll show you on this piece, you know, how I'm going to do it, and then I'll hop off camera and finish doing it so you don't have to watch me cut off seam allowances to 8 pieces. But basically what we're going to do is we're literally just going to carefully trim right on the stitching line. Oops. So I'm just being real careful because this is going to define the final shape of my pieces. And then plus some of the pieces have clips in the seam allowances, so that makes it hard to trace accurately as well. This is what the pieces are going to look like after all of the seam allowances are cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up all the pieces and I'll be right back. All right, so you can see I've cut off all of the seam allowances, and this is our upper front pieces. We're going to start with those, and we're going to make paper pattern pieces from these first. And I think it's a good idea before you start tracing to give your pieces just a little press to smooth out any wrinkles. So I'm just going to give this a nice little press. Look how much nicer that looks after it's pressed. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a piece of tracing paper over the fabric pattern pieces, and I can see through my paper. Now, if you're working with a gridded or dotted pattern paper like I am, use the grid in your favor. And what I mean by that is, don't just put the paper on top any old way and start tracing. Use the grid to create your vertical and horizontal balance lines, and that will help you see that everything is straight. So I'm going to start out over here, and I'm going to draw, I'm not tracing now, I'm just going to draw a line along the grid. Okay, so along the base of these little number 2s, I drew a straight line. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the center front edge on that line, and I really don't want anything to slip around, so I'm actually going to pin the fabric pattern piece to the paper in 2 places. And I'm going to do it at the bottom, making sure that the line is exactly even with the center front edge here. And then I'm going to do it again up at the top, making sure that the line is 100% even with the line I drew on the paper. Now I know for sure this fabric pattern piece isn't going to go anywhere. I can confidently trace around it without worrying about it shifting. I am just going to run my ballpoint pen along the edge of the fabric. And because the fabric has a little bit of height to it, the ballpoint pen slides right along that cut edge perfectly, making a very accurate line. I mean, you can use your ruler. If you want to use your ruler to draw your straightaways, you can. But really, I'm finding that the ballpoint pen stays right on the edge of the fabric that's underneath the paper. So I've traced my outside edge. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to mark my notches here, and I'll just put my apex in. I'll make that a dot. All right, so I've got my notches. I've got the whole outer edge. So now I'm going to do the same thing to my side front piece. Now the side front piece doesn't have a straight edge, so I'm just going to use the grain lines that I printed, and I'm going to line those up with the grid on the pattern paper. And you can see they line up perfectly, which tells me that using that square ruler really helps to create a perpendicular lines to each other, or vertical and horizontal lines that are exactly square with each other. So this is kind of a good test to that, because if my horizontal and vertical lines didn't line up, then that means I didn't draw my grain line straight. But you'll be able to see in a minute. I'm going to put them on here so you can see. Here's my horizontal grain line. Here's my vertical. You can see how straight that is. Okay, so then I'm just going to trace along the edge of this one. Now notice I'm leaving enough room between my pieces to add my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So don't butt them right up next to each other because we have to add seam allowances. You know, and again, if you want to use your ruler, you can on places where it's kind of straight. Okay, and again, I'm going to mark my notches. Okay. All right, so here's my center front and my side front. Okay. I've got my notches, I've got my apex marked on both pieces. Before we add seam allowances to these pieces, we're going to check to make sure the seams line up with each other and they sew together perfectly. So I'm going to take off the fabric pieces from underneath here. And I'm going to cut them apart, making sure I leave enough room in the center here to add 1/2 inch seam allowances to both pieces. Move this paper out of the way. I'm going to lay my center front onto my side front, and I'm going to start at the shoulder here. And I'm going to walk the pieces right along the stitching line. And what I'm checking for is to make sure, number one, the notches line up, which I'm traveling down. Okay, so you can see my notches are right here, and they are lining up. So then I'm going to start at the bottom and make sure those notches line up. And they do. All right, so that shows me that from the shoulder to the notch matches, and then from the base of the pattern to the bottom notch matches. So I know that these two edges sew together. So we're good here. The next thing I'm going to do is trace the side back piece so I can check to see if the side seams match. Let's press the two back pieces now. We'll give those a nice press. All right, so we'll start with the side back piece here. And I'm just going to pin it in a couple places, and I'm lining up that little horizontal guideline with the grid here. So I'll put one pin here, and I'll put one pin over here. All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and trace this piece. So if you use a ballpoint pen and you press down, it does a really, really nice job of skimming the edge of that fabric underneath the paper. I know my friend Eric might be a little judgy that I'm not using a tracing wheel, but I really think this gives us a nice accurate edge. I'm just going to use my ruler to do the shoulder here. Okay. All right, so I've traced that piece, and I think while I'm at it, I'm just going to trace the center back piece too. And I will create a straight edge along the base of this grid, the number 6s on this grid. And then I can line up my pattern piece with that. Pin it. So let me just go ahead and trace this. This is a straight line here. And then all right, so this is my center back, and this is my side back. And what I'm going to do, I didn't really create any notches here, so I'm going to measure up 5 inches from the base, and I'm going to put a notch. And I'm going to measure 5 inches up from the base, and I'm going to make a notch, just so we have something to match it to. All right, so again, I'm going to cut these pieces apart so we can make sure they match, and then we'll check the side seams and we'll check the shoulder seams as well. So again, let me just, I'm going to start at the bottom and line that up. I know these notches line up because I just drew them. I'm going to go to the top. There is an 1/8 inch difference between my side back and my center back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the difference on that. Anything less than 1/4, I'm not going to worry about in terms of like re-draping it. So this has got a little 1/8 inch difference. So I'll just show you. Here's where the side back ends. Here's where the center back ends. I'm going to take my tracing wheel and I'm going to split the difference, and I'm just going to trace through a line like that. That way, that will allow me to add that little bit to the back. So see, I'm adding, oh, I should have used green, I'm sorry. That little bit to that one, and then I'm going to take it off the center back piece. I'll use green so you can see. So see, what I've done is, to make it match, I added to this one, so this is now not right, and I took it down on this one. All right, so that's trued up. Now let's check out our side seam edges, and those are also off a little bit. So again, I'm going to split the difference. So they're matching here, and I'm going to just run it down the middle of the difference here. And I'm going to just tweak that. And then over here, I'm going to extend that. Just that little bit. So I'm just going to just do this. Okay. So for our side seams, I had to take off a little bit on the side front and add a little bit on the side back. The last thing we have to do is check the shoulder seam. So let's put our, I'm going to fold this one to the exact shoulder seam, and I'm going to put it right up against, okay, and you can see that that matches up perfectly. So my side, front and back shoulder seam matches. Okay, and there's a nice straight transition through the, you know, from front to back. So that's nice. So our shoulders match there. Let's make sure our shoulders match at the center front. I'll fold this one down. Okay, so we have something going on here, and I'm going to hazard a guess on the center front. For me, with my DittoForm, I'm going to guess the problem is at the neckline edge, because the base of my neckline isn't as defined on my DittoForm. So I'm going to go ahead and just true that up by adjusting the back to match the front like this. All right, so there we have that now matches. All right, so all of our front pieces are now ready for seam allowances. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to true up the front lower pieces, and then you could repeat that for the back lower pieces because it'll be exactly the same. So let me just finish up by showing you how to do the lower pieces. And again, I'm going to start with a little press. So let's give that a nice press. All right, so I have just enough paper here to do these two pieces. That's so exciting. All right, I'm going to add my vertical center front edge to the paper first. I'm going to line up my pattern piece with it. And I'm going to pin it. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing at the top. This piece is right now. Okay, and then I'm just going to quickly trace this, and this is going to be really easy because it's basically a rectangle. This piece, I can probably just use my ruler. Yeah, that was super easy. So this is my center front. Lower center front. Let's do our side front piece. So for the side front piece, I'm lining up that straight hip line edge on the grid. Okay, so you can see that's lined up really nicely like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin it in a couple places. And I'm just going to trace this. Okay. All right, so there is my side front, lower side front. And again, let's make maybe I'll go 6 inches this time. Make a guideline here. Let's check and make sure these match up. All right, so again, this is off about the same amount as the side, the upper pieces were. So again, I'm just going to trace the difference halfway. So I'm going to be adding like a 1/16 of an inch to 1 and shortening it. Okay, so if this was more than 1/4 of an inch, I would go back to my fabric and see where I screwed up draping. right, and then over here I'm just going to take this off. See, it's just that little bit. All right, so this is my side seam. So the last step to tracing is to trace the lower back pieces just like I traced these. Check to make sure the princess seam line matches, and then we're going to check to make sure the side seam matches. So I'm going to go ahead and just trace my back lower pieces off camera so this video isn't 4 hours long, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to true them up, and then we'll add seam allowances. All right, you can see I've traced my lower back pieces, and I already trued up the princess seam line in the back with the green, and I checked my side seam before I came on camera, and happy day, it matches perfectly. So like if I line up the lower pieces here, the lower edge, and then it matches at the top too. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a green line, a double notch right here to indicate the side seam. All right, so now we have one last thing to true up before we add our seam allowances. We want to make sure the edges between the upper and lower pieces match. So that's our last thing to check. Just gonna walk my front pieces, and I'm starting at the center front edge. And I'm just going to walk it along and make sure it matches. And this is off by a teeny little bit here. So here's where this one ends, and that's where that one ends. So it's like barely an 1/8 inch. So again, I am just going to find the center of that with my tracing wheel. And we're just going to true that up. So this is going to come in ever so slightly here. I'm going to do that. Okay. And then on this piece, I'm just going to let it out ever so slightly. So that will make those match. So if I fold this down now, you can see, okay, those now match. Let's check the edge between our side front pieces. So I'm just gonna again walk it along. Yep. My upper piece is, again, it's a little tiny bit, like a little 1/8 of an inch. So let's just, again, split that difference. So on this piece, we're going to add just a little bit here. Okay, and on this one, we're going to just take it in a little bit. Okay, so this is our new corner right here. All right, so now now the upper and lower edges are trued up. So go ahead and try to do your back pieces, and I'll see you back here in a minute to add those seam allowances. All right, so as luck would have it, my back pieces match perfectly between the upper and lower pieces, so I didn't have to do any adjusting in the back, so that's kind of cool. All right, so the final step to creating these pattern pieces is to add seam allowances. And this is the exact same technique that I did when I showed you how to add them onto the fabric. We're just going to add a 1/2 inch to all the edges. I'm going to do it in pink so you can see. And if you had to adjust anything, make sure you follow your adjusted line. So for example, on this bottom edge, I had to lengthen the side seam a little bit, so make sure you follow along with the right, the right line. So again, I'm just going to add that 1/2 inch all the way around. It seemed like a, like a silly step, but think about all of the effort you took to create accurate shaped pieces. So take a minute and really add accurate 1/2 inch seam allowances, because then when we go to sew them together accurately, we'll end up with a good result. So take your time, add seam allowances to all the edges on all the pieces. Like this. I'll just finish this one up with you, and then I'm going to hop off and finish the rest so I'm not riveting you with my adding a seam allowance ability here. On the curved edges, I use the short end of my ruler so I can accurately get that 1/2 inch around the curves. See, so on a curved area, if you just do short little dashes like this, that's the most accurate way to do a curve. All right, so there's one piece. I'm going to go ahead and add seam allowances to the rest of the pieces. I'm also going to cut them out. So when I come back, all of my pieces are going to look like this. Okay, so here's a completed piece, seam allowance, and trimmed. So I'm going to hop off and I'm going to complete all the pieces so they're just like this one, and I will be right back. I have my pieces laid out in front of me. You can see that these are the front pieces. I have all the seam allowances. I've trimmed them neatly, and I'm ready to go. So join me tomorrow for part 5, the finale of this sewing adventure, where I will show you how to cut out the pieces, sew them together, and actually get them on your dress form. I'm going to be working with a fabric that has a slippery side to it, because when I want to fit something onto my DittoForm, I'd like the cover to have a little bit of slickness to it, so when I'm putting things over its head, the garment I'm fitting will slide down. So join me for part 5 when I reveal this fabulous fabric and all the steps to cut out, sew together, and put the cover on your dress form. So I'll see you in part 5.